The chandelier light fell on 300 guests in silk and diamonds, and not one of them looked at the woman by the glass wall. Vivian Hart sat in her wheelchair, champagne untouched, invisible at her own family's wedding. Crowds drifted past as if she were furniture. Then a man in a worn gray suit, cut straight through the floor, stopped in front of her and asked the one question no one in that room had dared to ask all evening. "Why are you here alone?" The string quartet kept playing. No one else breathed. The Beaumont estate stood 30 miles north of the city, a stone manor lit from within by 12 crystal chandeliers, and from without by a string of warm lanterns lining the gravel drive. 300 guests had been invited to the wedding of a Hart cousin to a Beaumont son, and every one of them understood that the evening was less a celebration than a careful arrangement of power. Champagne moved on silver trays. A string quartet played in the east corner. The room smelled of white roses and old money. Vivian Hart sat near the tall glass wall on the south side of the ballroom, her wheelchair angled just enough to face the gardens rather than the dance floor. She wore a charcoal silk dress that had been chosen for her hair, pulled back, hands folded in her lap. At 38, she ran a tech company valued somewhere north of $4 billion, and tonight she had been parked beside a column like a piece of inherited furniture. The angle of the chair made it easy for guests to walk past without quite meeting her eyes. People did walk past. They greeted each other warmly 2 feet from her shoulder. They spoke about her in the soft, careful tone reserved for the recently deceased. A senator's wife touched the back of Vivian's wrist on her way to the bar, and then withdrew her hand as though she had touched something fragile. No one sat down. No one asked her how she was. Across the room near the service entrance, Adrian Cole was finishing the last of a glass of water and trying to remember the fastest route back to the parking attendants. He had not been invited to the wedding. He had been called out that afternoon to look at a stalled town car in the carriage house, the kind of job a man like him took because the estate paid in cash and paid quickly. The head of staff had asked him to stay through the dinner service in case any of the guests' vehicles refused to start in the cold. He had agreed because it meant another $200, and because in his line of work, you said yes when people with money asked. He was 41, had a steady set of hands, and a face that had spent too many years under fluorescent shop lights. The suit he wore was borrowed the gray, slightly out of fashion, the cuffs a half-inch short. He had been told to stand quietly near the back, accept nothing from the trays, and remain available. For most of the evening, that was what he had done. He noticed her the way a man notices a wrong sound in an engine. Something in the geometry of the room was off. 300 people moved in slow, glittering currents, and one woman by the glass wall sat at the dead center of a circle that no one stepped into. Adrian watched for almost 20 minutes. He watched a server walk past her 3 times without offering a refill. He watched 2 cousins speak about her in the third person, gesturing at the wheelchair as if it were empty. He watched a photographer cross the room twice, framing every angle of the ballroom except hers. What surprised him was not the cruelty of it. He had grown up in places where cruelty wore louder clothes. What surprised him was the precision. This was not neglect. Neglect would have been messy accidental. This was choreographed. Someone somewhere had decided that Vivian Hart was to be present, but not engaged, visible, but not addressed, and 300 guests had absorbed the instruction without ever being told it aloud. A woman in pearl gray glided through the crowd with the smooth, professional ease of someone who had done this many times before. She was perhaps 55, sharp-eyed, with the bearing of a person who had outlived 2 husbands and several boards. Adrian heard one of the staff refer to her as Miss Marsh. Elise Marsh moved from cluster to cluster, touching elbows, redirecting conversations, occasionally glancing toward the south wall, the way a shepherd glances toward a stray. Each time her eyes passed over Vivian, the wheelchair seemed to shrink a little further into the column behind it. Adrian watched Elise lean close to a young couple who had drifted toward the glass wall. He could not hear the words, but he saw the couple's smiles tighten, saw them turn 90 degrees and walk in the opposite direction, saw Elise straighten her sleeve and move on as if she had simply adjusted a vase. The young woman halfway across the room looked back over her shoulder at Vivienne with an expression Adrian recognized. It was the expression of someone who had been told kindly and firmly not to make things difficult. He set his glass down on the nearest tray. He should have walked the other way. The smarter version of the evening involved staying near the kitchen, collecting his cash, driving home before midnight. He had bills lined up on the kitchen counter that did not care about a stranger in a wheelchair. He told himself this twice before he was already moving. The crowd parted for him only because no one expected him. A mechanic in a borrowed suit, walking with deliberate purpose through a Beaumont wedding, was statistically an impossibility, and statistical impossibilities are usually mistaken for staff. He passed the quartet, past a champagne tower, past Elise Marsh, who registered him a half-second too late. He felt her eyes lock onto the back of his neck before he had taken 3 more steps. Vivienne did not see him approach. She was looking at the gardens, at the way the lantern light caught on the frost. When the shadow fell across her lap, she lifted her chin in the practiced, polite manner of someone preparing to be addressed by another well-wisher who would speak about her without speaking to her. Adrian stopped 2 feet in front of the wheelchair. He did not crouch, which would have been condescending, and he did not loom, which would have been worse. He simply stood at a respectful distance, hands at his sides, and looked at her the way one human being looks at another in a quiet room. "Why are you here alone?" he asked. The question landed in the silence between songs. The quartet had finished a piece and had not yet begun the next. For perhaps 3 full seconds, the nearest 20 guests heard the words clearly. A woman with a glass of red wine froze with the rim against her lower lip. A man at the bar half turned. Across the floor, Elise Marsh set down the canapé she had been holding and began to walk. Vivienne did not answer immediately. She looked up at Adrian with the still measuring expression of someone who had not been asked a direct question by a stranger in a very long time. The control she wore so well held for 1 heartbeat to 3. Then something in her jaw loosened almost imperceptibly, and Adrian understood that whatever happened next the evening had already stopped being the evening the Harts and the Beaumonts had planned. Vivienne held his gaze a moment longer, then answered in a voice quieter than the room expected. "Because that is where I was placed." The honesty of it caught Adrian off guard more than the words themselves. He had expected a deflection, the kind of polished line a woman in her position would have practiced for cocktail parties. Instead, she had given him the truth on the first try, and the truth was small and tired. He glanced once at the column behind her, at the angle of the wheelchair, at the half-empty glass of champagne someone had left on a side table out of her reach. "Has anyone spoken to you tonight?" Adrian asked. "My uncle briefly, about the timing of the toasts." Vivienne tilted her head a fraction. "He spoke to my shoulder." Elise Marsh arrived before Adrian could respond. She moved into the space beside the wheelchair with the easy authority of a woman who had managed the family's affairs for years, and her smile arrived a half-second before she did. Up close, she smelled of bergamot and discipline. She placed one gloved hand lightly on the back of Vivienne's chair, the gesture both protective and proprietary. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Elise said, addressing Adrian as though he were a vendor who had wandered in from the wrong door. "Are you with the catering team, or did one of our guests bring you?" "Neither," Adrian said. "I was working in the carriage house this afternoon. The estate staff asked me to stay through the evening in case anything mechanical needed attention." "I see." Elise's smile did not move. "Then I'm sure you understand that the ballroom isn't part of your assignment. Miss Hart has had a long day. She prefers a quiet space at events like these. She told me she was placed here." The small muscle at the corner of Elise's mouth tightened. Miss Hart's comfort is something I have managed personally for years. I think we can let her rest now. Adrian did not move. He kept his hands at his sides, his weight balanced, and he did the only thing he had learned, worked when someone with more money tried to redirect a conversation. He stayed exactly where he was and waited. The pause stretched long enough that two of the nearest guests turned away in embarrassment. Elise's hand on the back of the wheelchair tightened, then relaxed in a deliberate, almost theatrical release. She leaned down toward Vivian with the soft tone of a nurse explaining a medication schedule. "Vivian, dear, your father will want you near the head table for the speeches. Let me take you over." "In a moment, Elise." Vivian's voice had recovered some of its corporate steel. "I'd like to finish this conversation." "There isn't really a conversation to finish, sweetheart. The gentleman has work to attend to." "The gentleman asked me a question. I haven't answered it yet." Something passed between the two women that Adrian could not read entirely, but he could feel its weight. It was the weight of a long arrangement, a pattern repeated over years, a script that one of them had written and the other had learned to perform. For the first time that evening, the script had a missing line, and Elise was waiting with visible patience for Vivian to remember her cue. Vivian did not remember her cue. She turned her face an inch further toward Adrian, away from Elise's hand, and said, "Pull a chair up if you don't mind." Adrian found a small upholstered seat against the wall and brought it over. He set it down at an angle so that he would be at her eye level rather than above her, and he sat with his elbows on his knees, the way he sat at the counter of a diner. Elise remained standing for several seconds longer, then gave a tight, almost invisible nod and stepped back exactly 2 paces. She did not leave. She positioned herself near a column where she could watch them both, her hands folded, her expression composed into something close to maternal concern. "You're going to draw attention," Vivian said quietly. "I think I already did." That tends to be a problem at events like this. For who? She considered him. For people who are paid to manage me. Adrian let that sit. He had not expected her to say it out loud. Across the room, he could see Elise speaking to a man in a dark suit, her lips moving in short, efficient bursts. The man glanced toward the south wall, and then away. "I'm not trying to cause trouble for you," Adrian said. "I just thought it was strange. A woman alone in a room of 300 people. Nobody looking at her. I figured one of 2 things. Either you wanted to be alone, or someone wanted you to be. And if it's the first, then I'll stand up and walk away. No hard feelings." She did not ask him to walk away. She studied his face with a kind of clinical attention, the way she studied quarterly reports, and Adrian had the strange sense of being assessed by a department he did not work in. After a moment, her shoulders lowered by perhaps 1/4 of an inch. He recognized it because he had seen the same small surrender in his mother once the year before she died, when a stranger at a hospital cafe had asked her how she was sleeping and actually waited for the answer. "Tell me your name," Vivian said. "Adrian Cole." "And what do you do, Mr. Cole, when you're not standing in for the carriage house?" "I run a small shop on Fremont Street. Engines, mostly. Some body work when business is slow." "How is business slow?" Something almost like a smile touched the edge of her mouth, then disappeared. The string quartet began a new piece, a slow waltz that filled the room with the kind of soft anesthetic sound designed to cover any conversation that might become uncomfortable. Adrian noticed that the volume had been raised slightly. He noticed that 2 more of Elise's people had drifted into the space behind them, carrying empty trays they had no apparent destination for. "They're closing the circle," Vivian said, watching his eyes. "It's a thing they do, not aggressively. Just enough." "How long has it been like this?" She did not answer directly. Instead, she said, 5 years ago, I was driving back from a board meeting in upstate. A truck crossed the median on the freeway. I don't remember much after the headlights. When I woke up in the hospital, I had 3 fractured vertebrae, and a company that needed a chief executive who could still walk into a room and command it. The board was patient for the first 6 months. After that, they were less patient. She drew a breath. I kept the company. I lost most of the rest. What's the rest? The freedom to refuse what my family and my advisors decided was best for me. She glanced toward Elise without turning her head. She came on as my coordinator 9 months after the accident. She's been very thorough. Adrian had been trained by years of reading customers across a service counter to listen for the sentence under the sentence. He heard it now. The word coordinator did a great deal of work in Vivian Hart's life, and most of that work was not in her favor. "You hired her," he said. "My father hired her. I signed the paperwork because I was on painkillers, and grateful to have someone manage the schedule. That arrangement has not been revisited." A man in a navy tuxedo approached them, then smiling broadly with the easy entitlement of someone who had never been told no in any meaningful way. He was a Beaumont cousin, or a Hart cousin, Adrian could not tell, and he addressed Vivienne with an overwarmth that was clearly meant as a rescue. "Vivian, you absolute hermit hiding over here. Come, the toast is starting in 10 minutes. Your father is asking for you." He gave Adrian a quick, dismissive once-over. "Sir, I think Miss Marsh is looking for you near the kitchen." "She isn't," Adrian said. The cousin blinked. The smile held, but the eyes adjusted. "I'm sorry. Miss Marsh isn't looking for me near the kitchen. She's standing 12 feet behind you by the column watching this conversation." The cousin did not turn around. He did not need to. The information rearranged something in his face. He looked at Vivian, at the seat Adrian was sitting in, at the small distance between them, and he made a calculation that took less than 2 seconds. "Vivian," he said more quietly, "are you all right?" "I am perfectly fine, Charles. Tell my father I will be at the head table when I am ready." Charles withdrew. He did so with the slow, careful step of a man backing away from a wire he was not sure was live. Across the room, a small ripple moved through the gathered family, the way a small ripple moves through a pond when something has been dropped into the far end. Heads turned. Not many. Just enough. "Mr. Cole," Vivienne said, "you are going to get yourself thrown out of this house." "Probably. That doesn't bother you." "Lady, I came here to look at a carburetor. The tip is not worth my dignity." The line surprised her. It surprised her enough that the laugh escaped, before she could prevent it, a single short sound. Low and dry, the laugh of a woman who had not been amused by a man in some time. The sound carried farther than either of them intended. Elise's head turned sharply at the column. 2 waiters glanced toward the wall. The cousin halfway to the head table slowed his step. Vivian lowered her voice. "Listen to me carefully. The people in this room are not cruel in the way you think. They are not malicious. They are simply trained. My family made decisions about how my life would look after the accident, and Elise was hired to enforce those decisions on a daily basis. The script everyone is following tonight is a script I helped write in the months when I was too tired to read what I was signing. Do you understand? I think so. Then you understand that what you are doing right now is not a small thing. It is not a kind gesture. It is technically a violation of an agreement. And the people in this room have spent 5 years learning how to honor that agreement without ever calling it what it is. What is it? Vivian looked past him at the glass wall at the lanterns in the frost. It is the management of a person who is no longer permitted to manage herself. Adrian sat with that for a long moment. The waltz played on. The crystal threw soft, fractured light across the polished floor. He had walked into a wedding to fix an engine, and he was now sitting 6 feet from a woman who ran a $4 billion company and could not, by some quiet family arrangement, be addressed directly in public. You could end the agreement, he said. I could. She did not elaborate, but he saw the cost of the sentence cross her face. Elise approached again. This time she did not lean in. She stood squarely in front of the wheelchair, and her voice when she spoke was warm and clear enough to be heard by the nearest dozen guests, which Adrian understood was the point. "Vivian, your father has asked me to bring you over for the toast. The photographer is ready. Mr. Cole, I'm going to ask you politely to step away. We appreciate your work in the carriage house this afternoon. Mr. Holloway will see that you are paid before you leave." The dismissal was perfectly executed. It positioned Adrian as staff, paid him off, and removed him from the room in the same breath. Two men in dark suits had drifted into the space behind Adrian's chair without him noticing. They were not aggressive. They were simply present, and their presence completed the pattern. Adrian stood up slowly. He looked down at Vivian, and for a moment the noise of the room receded. A person doesn't lose their value because they can't stand up anymore, he said. Whatever they've told you about why this room is treating you like a ghost, it isn't true. You're not a problem to be managed. You're the only person in here who isn't pretending. Vivian's composure cracked. It was a small crack, a hairline the kind only visible to someone watching closely. Her eyes filled not with tears that fell, but with the brighter, more dangerous kind that stayed on the surface and refused to spill. Her hand resting in her lap closed around a fold of charcoal silk and didn't release. Elise moved to take the handles of the wheelchair. She didn't get them. "Don't," Vivienne said very quietly. Elise stopped. The two men in dark suits stopped. The waltz mercifully ended. The room hung for a single suspended second on the edge of a decision that had been postponed for 5 years, and Adrian Cole stood between a woman and the system that had been built around her, and waited to see which way she would choose. The single word held the room in place. Elise Marsh's hand hung an inch from the handle of the wheelchair, gloved fingers curled around nothing. The two men in dark suits did not advance and did not retreat. Across the ballroom, 100 conversations had quieted by degrees, the way a tide pulls back before it returns, and the guests who had spent the evening pretending not to notice Vivian Hart were now openly watching her. Vivian did not look at Elise. She looked at her own hands, at the way they had gripped the silk of her dress, at the small white knuckles she had not been aware of making. When she spoke again, her voice was low, but it carried the way a chief executive's voice carries even when she is not trying. "I would like everyone to step back, please. 3 feet. Including you, Elise." Elise did not move immediately. The hesitation was brief, almost invisible, but Adrian saw it, and so did Vivienne. It was the hesitation of a person calculating whether the order would be backed up by anything beyond the moment. Elise had spent 5 years learning that Vivienne's instructions in public rarely held past the next morning. The calculation tonight was different, and Elise's instinct, professional and well-trained, was to wait one more beat to see if the moment would pass. It did not pass. Vivienne lifted her eyes to her then, and the look in them was not anger. It was something quieter and more dangerous. It was the look of a woman who had finally finished reading what she had signed. 3 feet, Elise. Now, Elise stepped back. The two men in dark suits adjusted with her almost in formation, and the small cordon that had closed around the wheelchair loosened. A breath moved through the nearest part of the crowd, half relief and half the collective awareness of having witnessed something that would be discussed in this family for a long time. Vivienne turned her face toward Adrian. She did not ask him to sit again. She placed her hands on the wheels of her chair on the rims, where her own palms could grip them, and she pushed. The chair turned slowly away from the column, away from the glass wall, until she was facing the room directly. The angle she had been parked in for 3 hours was gone. She was for the first time that evening looking at her own family, the way she looked at a board. "I would like to say something," she said. Her voice carried the small amplification of a room that had decided all at once to listen. "I have spent 5 years being arranged. I have allowed it because I was tired. and because the people who arranged me told me kindly and consistently that it was for my comfort. I want to thank them for the kindness. I would like to be very clear that the arrangement is over." Her father, a tall man with silver at his temples, was already moving toward her from the head table. He did not reach her in time. Vivienne kept her eyes on the room. "I am not a centerpiece. I am not a logistical concern. I am the chief executive of a company many of you have invested in, and I am the daughter of a family many of you have known for a long time, and I have been treated tonight, and many nights before tonight, as a problem that was solved before the room was opened. That is going to change. It changes now." She let the silence sit. She did not fill it. Adrian had been watching her face, and what he saw there wasn't triumph. It was something more like grief that had finally been allowed into the building. Her father reached her side. His face was tight, the careful composure of a man whose private arrangements had just become a public matter in front of 300 witnesses. He set a hand on her shoulder, a gesture meant to look paternal, and meant Adrian understood to close the moment. "Vivian," her father said low and firm, "this is not the place. We will speak about this at home." "We will speak about it now, Dad." The home was where it stopped being a conversation. He held her gaze a long second, and Adrian watched the calculation move across the older man's face, the same calculation he had seen in the cousin earlier, only slower and more painful. The hand on her shoulder loosened. Vivienne reached up, took it gently in her own, and placed it back at his side. "I love you. Not now." The hand stayed where she had placed it. He did not step away. He simply stood there 3 feet behind her chair, hands returned to his pockets, and for the first time that evening, looked at his daughter with something that resembled attention. Elise tried one final time with the soft, professional warmth that had carried her through 20 years of difficult families. "Vivienne, you're tired. Let me take you upstairs, and we can talk through any concerns in the morning with your father, and we can revisit anything you'd like, Elise." Vivienne's voice had quieted but lost no edge. "Your employment with my family ends tonight. You will be paid through the end of the quarter. My attorney will contact you on Monday. I do not want you in my house, in my office, or near my schedule again." The pearl gray composure on Elise Marsh's face did not break. It simply set like cement into a different shape. She inclined her head once the smallest possible acknowledgement, and turned and walked out of the room without looking back. The 2 men in dark suits did not follow her. They looked at Vivienne's father, and Vivienne's father, after a long second, gave them a short nod that meant stand down. They drifted toward the bar and became guests again. The string quartet, with the professional instinct of musicians who had played many awkward weddings, began a soft, neutral piece designed to give a room permission to resume itself. The guests did not resume cleanly. Conversations restarted in low fragments, then died, then restarted again. A handful of older couples drifted toward the coat check with murmured excuses. 2 of the senior cousins gathered near the bar and spoke without looking at each other. The wedding kept moving, because weddings always kept moving. But the geometry of the room had changed. The dead circle around the south wall was gone. People drifted toward Vivienne, now, not in a flood, but in ones and twos, the way people approach someone they have been meaning to speak to for a long time. Adrian stepped back. He did so without ceremony, without a goodbye, the way a man steps back from a fire he has helped start and does not need to manage. He was not part of what was about to happen. He had never been. He had only been the wrong sound in the engine, and the sound had been heard. Vivienne caught his sleeve before he could turn fully away. Her fingers were cold and firm. She did not pull him back. She simply held the cuff long enough that he stopped. "Mr. Cole." "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you for asking the question." Adrian looked down at her. She was not crying. The brightness in her eyes had receded into something steadier, the look of a woman who had been given back the controls of a vehicle she already knew how to drive. "You'd have asked it eventually," he said. "I just got there first." "Maybe. Maybe not." He did not argue with her. He gave a small nod and gently freed his sleeve, and she let him. He walked back through the crowd the way he had come, except that this time the crowd noticed him, and several of them stepped slightly aside to let him pass, with something that was not quite respect and not quite curiosity, but contained pieces of both. He passed the champagne tower. He passed the quartet. He passed Charles, who met his eyes briefly and gave a short, almost embarrassed tip of the head. "Mr. Holloway." The head of staff was waiting near the service door with an envelope. Adrian took it, looked inside, looked at Holloway, and handed back 2 of the bills. "The job was the carburetor," Adrian said. "The rest of the night I was just standing around." Holloway, who had worked for the Beaumonts for 31 years and had seen many things, took the bills back without comment and held the door. The cold outside was sharp and clean after the perfumed warmth of the ballroom. Adrian crossed the gravel drive to the lot where his truck was parked between 2 black town cars that cost each of them more than his shop earned in a year. He stood for a moment beside the driver's door and looked back at the manor. The tall glass wall on the south side glowed warmly. He could see from this distance a small group gathered now around a wheelchair that had been moved away from the column. He could not see Vivian's face. He did not need to. He got into the truck. The engine which he had tuned himself started on the first turn. Inside the ballroom, Vivian Hart was answering a question her aunt had asked her, the first direct question her aunt had asked her in nearly a year. Her father stood 3 feet behind her, still quiet, still watching the way a man watches something he had assumed was settled, and was now learning was not. The photographer had begun finally to take photographs that included her. The angle of her chair was her own choice now. The champagne in her glass had been refilled by her own hand. She would not see Adrian Cole again. There would be no follow-up dinner, no letter, no engineered reunion. He would go back to the shop on Fremont Street, and she would go back to her company, and the lives they had touched for 90 minutes on a winter evening would continue separately and without sentiment. That was how it should be. He had not come to save her. He had come to ask one question in a room where no one else would. And the question had done what questions do when they are asked at the right time by the right stranger in the only voice available. The lanterns along the gravel drive flickered as his truck pulled away. Inside, the wedding continued. And for the first time in 5 years, Vivian Hart was visible at her own family's table, on her own terms, in a room that had finally remembered how to look at her.